Hi there. If we haven't met before, my name is Kate Roseth and I'm a certified Iyengar yoga teacher and the founder of Yoga Branches. I'm a practitioner of the Iyengar yoga method and I love to share with other practitioners ways of getting on the mat, inspiration to get on the mat, motivation to get on the mat, and anything that will help to create a regular and consistent home yoga practice. So that's why we're here today. I'm going to talk to you through a way to plan out an entire month's worth of practices. So we're going to start looking at the big picture and nail it down to what you might do on the mat every single day. One of the biggest challenges of maintaining a regular practice is keeping it interesting and having a plan and knowing what you're doing on the mat each day. And when we have a plan and know what we're doing, then our practice is more focused and our time on the mat is more efficient, and we definitely feel more satisfied at the end. So that's it. We're going to do that now in the next 20 minutes. We're going to walk through step by step planning out your month's worth of practice. So if you haven't already, download the worksheets on this page and get ready to click through with me, and we will start to plan our entire month's practice so that starting tomorrow, you've got a plan for what you're going to do every single day of the month. And not only will you find that your practice is more regular, that your time on the mat is more efficient, but you'll also find that your progress in your practice grows and develops because of this planning. Let's jump into it. Welcome to the 30-day Plan Your Practice video tutorial. Hopefully you've downloaded the downloadable on this page and you are now following along with me. You've got this sheet in front of you. You can either print it out and fill in the lines with your pen, or you'll see, as I am on the screen here, you can actually click into the sections and complete the document online as well, so that you can fill it in and type in. So you've got those options there. That's a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This video tutorial is a three-part section video. So the first part, we're going to be looking at the whole month's practice, the big picture. The second part, we'll be talking about the weeks in the month, and then at the end, in the third section, we're going to be talking about the days of the week. So we're really looking at the big picture and then nailing it down to the nitty-gritty of what you're going to do each day of the week. So let's jump in and get started. Here we're going to start in the very center section here, looking at a theme. So the way I want you to come up with your theme for the month, because remember this section we're just looking at the whole big picture, is I want you to think about a pose that you would really like to start to practice. A pose that you've perhaps never done before, one that maybe you've done in class once or twice and thought, I'd like to do that one a bit more. So we want it to be a meaty, chunky pose that you can sink your teeth into, and that it will give you something to flesh out and work on. So we're going to call it the hero pose for the purpose of this exercise and throughout this video. And in this section here, I want you to write down that hero pose, and you might need some time to think about that. I'm going to step you through, but that's the first thing to come up with, is your hero pose, a pose that is definitely challenging for you, and it's not something that you include in your daily practice yet. So I'm going to put handstand as my hero pose for the purpose of this exercise. That's Adho Mukha Vrikshasana. Okay, so once you've got your hero pose, we're actually going to skip points 1 and 2 and just jump down into 3. I want to give a little explanation here before we move on. I want you to list out categories of poses. So you might need a little intro into what I mean by categories of poses. Categories of poses are groups of poses. So for example, you would have standing as a category of poses. You might have sitting, inversions, back bends. I think you're getting the gist now. So I want you to start to list out all the categories of poses that you can think of. And you can be broad or really detailed here. It's up to you. There's sort of 7 categories: standing, sitting, inversions, back bends, arm balances, forward bends, and then you can even go beyond that and start to include twists and break it down, and balancing poses, and break it down even further than that. But what I want you to do is just start by listing out here all the categories of poses that you can think of, so that you've got them at hand, because you're going to be drawing on them throughout the whole month. Great. So now that we've got our categories of poses, let's jump up to section 1 here and start to list out categories of poses that specifically relate to your hero pose. And the way that you identify what categories of poses relate to your hero pose is by looking at the hero pose, looking at the shape of the pose, and that will give you a few clues as to what categories of poses will help you to practice to lead towards the hero pose. So for example, with Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, some categories of poses that are required, and I know this by looking at the shape and by practicing the pose, that so also by looking at the actions that are required to do the pose, that's going to give you a few clues as well as to which categories of poses you need to identify. So for Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, the handstand pose, I would say abdominals are a category of poses I need to practice to prepare for my handstand. I would put in perhaps arm balances, arm balancing poses, and standing poses. Now, I just want you to write 3, perhaps 4 categories here. Don't go too crazy. We want to sort of start to fine-tune a little, which we will in the next stage even more, but already here. So these are going to be my 3 categories of poses that I think are necessary for practicing Adho Mukha Vrikshasana. Now let's start to break that down a little bit more, moving here on to step 2 and listing the asanas that are in each of those categories. So I'm going to just put at the top here abdominals, and then at the top here arm balances, and then here standing. So I've got now my 3 categories that lead specifically to my hero pose, and then within that I'm going to start to list out actual poses. So I would put here Urdhva Prasarita Padasana. I have to excuse my spelling of Sanskrit. So Urdhva Prasarita Padasana, and any other abdominal poses that might lead towards or support Adho Mukha Vrikshasana. So I don't want to just list out any abdominal poses. I want to think about ones that are going to be specifically helpful in preparing me for handstand. So another one would be Paripurna Navasana, and perhaps another one would be oh, I just thought of it and now I've forgotten it. Supta Parangustasana could come under that category there. And the list goes on. So really, you want to start listing out all of the poses in the abdominal category that you think are going to lead towards your handstand pose. And just remember, keep looking at the pose. Look at the shape of the pose and think about what other poses have a similar shape. And look at the actions that are required in the pose and think about other poses that have similar actions as well. So you're going to do that for each section, the abdominals, the arm balances, and the standing. Now this is for me, for Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, but you've got your own hero pose there, and then you'll have your own categories of poses listed. Make sure that you think about poses that are specific to your handstand. So for example, in the standing section, don't just list any standing poses. Start to think about standing poses that are more closely related to handstand. For example, Pajvoltanasana, I would put there. Virabhadrasana 3, I would include there. And I would choose those over Trikonasana or Pajvakonasana because the actions and the shape of the pose have more likeness to handstand than the others. Okay, that's quite a bit of work there already, but let's move right on over to section 4 here and start to just think about any limitations or injuries or considerations that we need to have for the month. So I want you to list these out now because remember we're looking at the whole month and we want to have the big overview. So this might be things like if you're menstruating, you want to write what week of the month you're going to be menstruating because you don't want to plan a whole backbend series that week when you're in the middle of your period. Or perhaps you're traveling, you want to consider the time that you're traveling and how that's going to affect what you're practicing. You might have injuries that you need to consider. There's just different things that are going to pop up during the month that you want to know ahead of time so that when you get onto the mat, you can actually practice what you've planned and you don't have to come up with something else because you weren't prepared. So here I would start to list, week 2 in October, there's menstruation, and perhaps week 3, October, travel. Okay, and then lastly, any questions that you have around your hero pose. This is where you want to start to list out any doubts, questions, challenges that are arising for you. And for sure there are going to be some because remember, the pose that you've chosen is a meaty one. It's a challenging one. It's one that you don't practice and perhaps don't know very much about. So here, start to list out any questions that you might have. There might be questions around placement of the body in the pose. So exactly where the hands and legs and feet are in relation to each other, in which case you can look that up in a book, find the picture of the pose, look at exactly how it's placed. It might be about actions of the pose. You're not completely sure about what actions are required. So it's time to start doing some homework, getting a little bit more familiar with that hero pose so that when you start to plan out your sequences, you're more informed about which poses to choose. And you'll see down the bottom of the document here, I've just given you a few tips for these steps above, pretty much what I've talked through, but if you need a little bit more help, then you can refer here to get a few more ideas about how to completely fill out this page, which is part 1, the whole month overview of planning your practice. So when you're ready, move on to part 2, and we'll start looking at how each week of the month looks. Moving on to part 2, we're going to start to plan out the weeks of the month. So we're not getting too fine detail here, but we are going to start to pull from the first page in this document to fill out how the weeks are going to start to look. So the first step is actually going to the very end and here in the notes and considerations, writing in each week what things you need to consider. So from my document, I had that in week 2, I'll be menstruating, and I think I had week 3 that I'll be traveling. So this is where you're going to start to list out some notes and considerations that you need to have during the month. I'll talk a little bit more about injuries and how you can consider that in more detail in your sequencing and practice. So let's look at the more general things that are occurring during the month here, and you'll fill out each of those in each week so that you can keep that in mind as you start to plan out your weeks. Then you will go to week 1 and into the general category. So here I want you, not to the general category, to the hero category. And here you're going to put in 1 or 2 categories of poses from the 3 or 4 that you chose that relate specifically to your hero pose. So you need to refer back to that first page. I had, for Adho Mukha Vrikshasana, I had arm balances, abdominals, and standing poses. And so you can have 3 or 4 there that you might have written down, and you're going to choose 2 now for here. So in hero category, I'm going to choose in week 1, I'm not menstruating and I'm not traveling and it's going to be a normal week for me. So I'm going to include in there abdominals and standing. And you'll go through and do that for each week, having 2. I mean, it's up to you. You'll see soon, but you can have 1, 2, 3 categories there. I kind of like to have not too many so that my week is more focused and more planned. The more categories you have there, the more dispersed it is. And the less you have, the more focused it is. So in week 2, I'm menstruating. So I don't want to be doing abdominal poses, so I'm not going to put that category. And arm balances also don't lend very well to when you're menstruating. So I'm just going to put standing in that week. In the week that I'm traveling, I'm going to continue my practice. It might be a little disrupted, but let's put in there some arm balances and standing again. And then in the last week, I'm going to put arm balances and abdominals. Okay, from here, then you're going to put in your general categories. So the reason here you only need 1 or 2 is because we've got other categories of poses we're also going to include in our practice. We're not only going to practice the hero category poses. So here I'm going to start to fill in and put in an extra 1 or 2 categories of other categories that are in the general list. So with the abdominals and standing, then I might want to also include inversions. Inversions. And then here I'm menstruating, so I won't be doing inversions. Another category of pose that's going to go well that week for me is going to be restorative or even sitting poses because I'm menstruating and I want to have a good balance that week. In week 3, I'm doing arm balances and standing. So to balance and include extra poses in that week, I could include inversions and perhaps also sitting. Or let's be more specific, and I'm going to put actually forward bends. And then in this last week here, I'm going to put back bends and inversions. I'm filling this out quickly. You can spend a little bit more time thinking about which categories of poses are going to be more complementary depending on what you've got in the hero category there. And then the last step will be going through and writing the specific asanas that you want to include in that week's practice. Now you've already done half of the work for this. You've already written out the list of poses relating to your abdominals and standings that relate specifically to your hero pose. So you can go ahead, copy and paste them in here and start to write out those poses. I know that I had Urdhva Prasarita Padasana, and another one would be Vashisthasana. I know I didn't have that on the other list, but that was the one I was thinking of. And I had Paripurna Navasana, and I had in my standings Viratri, and I also had Parsvottanasana. So you can start to list there as well. So I've just listed the poses, asanas from my hero category, but then I also want to add some poses or asana that are coming from my inversions category in the general category there. So then I'll include Shirshasana and Savangasana and any other inversions that I want to throw in there. I might want to throw in my hero pose and do a handstand or a half handstand or any kind of version of a handstand that I can manage. So that's how you're going to fill out this weekly plan. And the more you have there in that specific asana to practice column, the better off you're going to be in the 3rd stage when we move to next. So just a little overview here. start by writing your notes and considerations for the month. Then jump over into your hero categories and spread them out throughout the month so that they're all covered. You can repeat them, that's fine. Have a minimum of one, and I would say a maximum of 3 in that hero category there. And then in your general category, having another 1 to 3 categories of poses. And then the last step is to start to write out all the asana that you can think of that relate to your hero pose and start to list them out so that we can move on to the third section, which is starting to prepare each sequence that you're going to practice each day of the week. So once you finish this, you can move on to the next part of the video, part 3, planning your daily practice sequences. Welcome to part 3 of the Plan Your Practice workshop. Here we start to look at what we're going to practice each day of the week. Now the first step here is to start to plan out the day in terms of how long you're going to practice for, what time you're going to practice, and what you're going to actually practice. So let's just start with including here the time of day, the duration, and the what. So at the time of day, you want to choose a time of day that you know you're going to be available, so it's good to plan ahead. I would only ever recommend working 1 week ahead. So on the weekend, I would sit down and I would plan out the whole week. Rather than trying to do the whole month, it's a little bit unrealistic to know what you're going to be doing at 6 a.m. on week 4 of your month. So just start week at a time. And you write down the time of day that you want to practice. So I know that on Monday, a good time for me is 6 a.m. I don't start work until 9, so that gives me plenty of time to get my practice in and get ready for work and get the kids to school. In terms of duration, you write your duration that you plan to practice each day. I'm just going to put 20 minutes in here, and I'm doing that for a really good reason. When we first start to practice at home on our own or trying to get a regular practice, it's more important the regularity than the duration. So I really stress that you put a duration of time that you can manage, that is really easy for you to achieve. Once you can consistently practice 10 or 20 minutes a day, then you can increase the duration of practice. Now, what you're going to practice each day is key as well. You don't have to create the sequence yourself every single day. You can look to books for sequences. You can find lead practices online. As you'll know, I've got the membership site where you can have a whole host of lead practices with different themes and durations to choose from. So following sequences from books, following online videos, taking notes from what you've done in class and repeating a sequence that you did in class, and writing your own are a few ways that you can start to prepare what you're going to practice. So I'm just going to jot that down there to do what you did in class. You can write a sequence. You can download a PDF sequence, and you can do a video sequence. So there's a whole list there of choices that are available so that you don't have to create the sequence yourself every single day of the week, because that can get tiresome and a little repetitive when you're doing it all on your own. So go ahead now, complete each day of the week, what time you're going to practice, the duration that you're going to practice, and where you're going to pull your sequence from before we move into the last stage of planning your practice and actually start to create some sequences. So here, when we come to plan our sequences, you want to write at the very top there the duration that you're planning to practice for. And then in this case, if you're going to choose a video sequence, then you want to make sure you're choosing a video sequence that is in line with what you had planned for the week of the month. So if you had standing, abdominals, and arm balances, then make sure that you're choosing a sequence that is in line with your hero pose. However, this is where we're actually going to start to create a sequence. Now, creating a sequence is in itself a whole other workshop. But what I encourage you to do is download the other document in this little package, which shows you how to draw your own stick figures and start to write them down. In this format, if you draw your stick figures in a line across the page, and you might have 2 or 3 lines depending on how long your sequence is going to be, then it's really easy for you to create a practice and a sequence that flows. So I'd really encourage you to get comfortable with drawing those stick figures opposed to writing the Sanskrit. It'll be more easy to identify what pose is coming next and to create a more fluid practice. So you really do have your work cut out for you. There's quite a bit of preparation and planning that goes into creating a whole month's worth of sequences, but it's totally possible. With that downloadable of drawing your stick figures, you'll then start to create sequences based on what you did in part 2. Looking at all the list of poses that you have there, you simply grab that list of poses, go to the document with the hand-drawn stick figures, and order them in alliance with how that document suggests that you lay out a sequence. So you're getting a good order of practices. You don't want to have the order all mixed up. It tends to give the body and the mind a whacked out feeling, shall we call it, afterwards. So ordering and having a correct sequence of poses is really important. And I give you a general indication in that document of a good order that you can follow, so that you're going to feel balanced and like you've done an all-round of practice at the end. So there's no quick fix for planning your practice. It definitely takes a bit of work and planning. However, can you imagine how good it's going to feel once you've done just a whole week's worth of sequences, to start the week knowing that you've planned your practice, to know that you're going to get on the mat with a plan, to know that you have a whole sequence of poses ready to do, to know that your time on the mat is going to be more efficient, and that the progress you're going to make in your practice will be significant. You will really notice the difference in your ability and your progress when you start to apply yourself in this way in your practice. Best of luck. Don't think too far ahead. Just plan 1 week ahead. So really mark out that each weekend you're going to sit down for half an hour or an hour and map out your week, and then print it out and have it ready to follow along. And I can't wait to see how your practice improves, becomes more regular and more consistent. Good luck.